Good morning, it's February 28th, 2018. And I wanted to make a second video related to the issue of what Mildred Bangs Wynkoop got wrong. Basically, I wanted to explain to you from the words of Richard Taylor his argument. I think that, if you're going to make statements like he made in the God's Revivalist magazine that I showed you earlier, you need to back those statements up with some kind of proof. Well, my question for those who have publicized their disagreement with Richard Taylor on the issue of if Wynkoop denied original sin or not, my question for you is, basically, is there an interest in this subject that is being denied, and that the grassroots people in Wesleyanism, and specifically in the Church of Nazarene, have a curiosity about this subject, and does it need to be discussed more? And I think it very much does, and I think it brings a discussion panel wherever it goes. For instance, if you look at my videos, other than this video here, if you look at the different number of watches I've had, the highest amount of watches I've had is on my confrontational aorist tense video, but it has about 900 and plus watchers. Okay, but if you look at the rate that my video on Wynkoop is generating attention, there's about 150 watches just in a matter of months. And if you look at the other amount on the different videos I've had, you can see they've been out there, some of them for years, and they haven't been watched that much. So to me, I think that illustrates what I just asked you, one of two factors. And I'm pretty realistic, and so I can kind of come down to terms that it could be interpreted a couple different ways, and this is what I understand it to be. Number one, I think that she, and this is my question for you, is she known because of her infamy, or because she did a good work and she's famous within the church? I think if you look how much people are paying attention to this, they probably heard that she was confrontational and that she had been highly debated in the church. And another assertion that I think supports that concept is the fact that Mark Quanstrom, when he wrote his book, A Century of Holiness Theology in 2004, and he gets to the part about Wynkoop versus Richard Taylor, I think he does a pretty balanced job. But if you look at it closely, I think that he kind of gives hints that he's probably not in agreement with Wynkoop or her influence on the church, because he makes some very strong assertions. He says, for instance, that Dunning was asked as Wynkoop's fruit. He was asked to be the next replacement theologian for H. Orton Wiley, but he aggressively attacks that concept, at least brings up what really happened in fact, which was that H. Ray Dunning was questioned by Richard Taylor and others in the church. Should his theology be brought into the church when it stands out against certain statements in the manual? And the Church of Nazarene was willing to publish that back in 2004. They tell you that story through Mark Quanstrom's words, and I think that suggests that every time that Wynkoop's brought up, even by somebody who may or may not be supporting her, I'm not sure which place Quanstrom stood in for sure, but more than likely to me, he did not support her assertions. I think that they have to bring it up as a confrontational issue, and that's exactly how he writes of it in 2004. It's not brought up as it's just everybody was on the same page with her. And so I think this is generating a lot of attention. The second reason it could be generating attention is because it's a shockwave. Maybe people don't realize that, people have an issue against Wynkoop or her positions that she presented in her main book, A Theology of Love. Matter of fact, I kind of left something out of the last video, but it was, in fair treatment. But if you look at what Richard Taylor actually said about her, he actually said that the influence of one book was the cause of the swaying of the holiness movement, towards death. Okay, so he felt very strongly about what he said. Okay, and like I said, in a minute I'm going to present to you his own defense. Okay, I think that's fair. But in light of the fact that if my second theory is the truth, that people are just shocked, they don't realize that Dunning or Wynkoop have people who have opposed their theories in the church, okay? And this is a shockwave that I'm sending out, that people don't understand Wynkoop did anything wrong or something along that lines. Well, if that's the case, then why have you heard about positions against Richard Taylor, but you have not heard about the theories or positions held against Wynkoop? I think that's, again, defending the position of what I'm talking about here. This needs to be discussed. This should be discussed in a public forum. There should be people there, not just professional theologians, so to speak, but maybe some people from the grassroots level. They want to hear the answers to this, and so let's let Taylor make his argument. Okay, if Wynkoop has been defended, which I believe she has, I think she has publicly. I think Taylor and his influence need to be brought out and discussed in full length, which Quanstrom kind of failed to do. He didn't give the whole entire position of Taylor. Okay, now if you were to look up in our Beacon Dictionary of Theology, and there's a newer one, and I've read most of that in its entirety, but if you go back to the original one that was done like in the 80s, okay, if you look up relational theology, which was the position of Wynkoop and Dunning, you will not get Wynkoop or Dunning as the author of that text, of that article. There's a lot of articles written by many different theologians within Wesleyanism or Nazarene Church in the Beacon Dictionary of Theology, but it's interesting that the conservative Richard Taylor, as the editor of that edition, felt he needed to publish his opinion on that. Well, here's some of those arguments. He talks about a historical development, and he says that the problem with relational theology, and I'm giving you his article in short, is he says is whenever it's related to process theology, which was a liberal philosophy that was brought up in like the 1930s, and through a man named Alfred Whitehead, and but it basically tried to explain all of philosophical being or ontological argument from the position of process, and obviously these are liberal theologians. They've gone to the extremes where they've read process into Jesus, process into God, etc., etc. But so he's saying when relational theology departs from Wesleyanism specifically, it always does so when they start relating it to process theology. Now, if you're not aware, Wynkoop wanted us to look at Alfred Whitehead's corrections to John Wesley. If you go to the very earliest introduction in her Theology of Love, pages 11 to 14, she says that. She tells you that we need to look at his theories, Whitehead's theories, this liberal, in order to come to a better balance, okay? Especially about the concepts of crisis and process. Okay, so she very clearly was a student of Whitehead's. All right, and even though he had long been passed by the time that she was having her influence, that's what her position was. Okay, and so here he's giving a historical development of process theology. Okay, inside that article on relational theology, and he says, after the origination of these theories in Germany, okay, so this is right when liberalism was born, okay, in Europe, progressive concepts of theology were introduced to America. Henry Wyman first brought process theology to Chicago. So if you want to see where the liberals are coming out or where they're earning their degrees, it's Chicago. Interestingly, the University of Chicago, and it's always been that way, which afterwards in 1927 became the center of process studies. There are three historical stages of development in quote-unquote process thought, beginning with the evolutionary theory of Charles Darwin that was later modified to his present formulations. Most people don't realize that relational theology and process theology, as they are equated, were born in the liberal theory of Charles Darwin. Okay, and if you've watched or read in my Facebook or posts or anything else, you'll realize that he was totally teaching on a false assumption. There's no databases in Charles Darwin's day. Geology was at a very limited form of study at that time, obviously. And before they did the scientific work, they progressively put this stuff on the Bible, and on it goes. And this was the formation of where relational theology was born. Okay, it wasn't born in John Wesley's teaching. Don't let somebody tell you that. This is the truth. Okay, apparently Richard Taylor did his homework. Okay, so secondly, he starts going through these stages, and he makes representative philosophers. I wouldn't even call them theologians. Going back to the later centuries after the apostles, there's some that came along, very few, but they came along on the outskirts of orthodoxy, and they would defend this kind of theory. So he says the first was that line of thought that runs through the systems of Charles Darwin, G.W.F. Hegel, Karl Marx, and you know exactly what's being implied by all this, Heraclitus, which is the earlier church father that was off base, Karl Marx, Henry Bergson, and John Dewey, and etc. All right, so there's just this blatant form. It was more of the evolutionary theory, but it was based on process. Evolution is a process. Okay. The second phase included the optimistic theses of dynamism, development, and improvement in the work of Teilhard de Chardin and those influenced by him. If you're aware of Teilhard de Chardin's influence, he was involved in the hoax of trying to defend evolutionary theory by taking certain things that were not attached originally to bones and trying to make them appear like they were, in order to support his theory of evolution, to find those missing links. Okay, and but this man's influence, he had more of a positive focus than the original theory of evolution. Just process. It was process with more of an optimistic twist. Okay, and then the third stage was Alfred North Whitehead. He lived 1861 to 1947, and it's a third strain of philosophical theology that, by then it became a theology shortly after his work, that reinterprets the Christian faith in a sense of developing, changing, dynamic understanding of reality. Process thought was also largely influenced by the work of Charles Hartshorne, 1897 to the present time that Beacon theology was written, Schubert Ogden, Daniel Williams, Norman Pittenger, and John B. Cobb. John B. Cobb's an interesting name because they asked him right out of process theology to write a book on John Wesley. Okay, so Wynkoop's not the only one. He's in the Methodist Church, and he's the father of process theology within the United Methodist Church. And so it's interesting how this all works when you really see it come together. And so that's why he's telling you this. He wants you to understand that that's where the liberal bend of this starts to come into play. Now, another time that Richard Taylor defends himself, not only showing the roots of relational theology when it has the twist of process theology, which is Wynkoop's theory in summary. He was writing a third volume, which is one of the most influential volumes, of the 3-volume set, and this is called Exploring Christian Holiness, the Theological Foundation. He wrote that in 1985, and on the third volume on page 77 in a footnote, notice how he had to do that. Wynkoop could put things very directly in her books, and so could Dunning, even statements that confront the current statements in the Manual of the Church of the Nazarene. But this man has to footnote his theory or his position, because it's not popular, but it's still there. Okay, and I believe he's supported his theory. Listen to this. What he's actually going to charge that theory with, that there's no original sin, and that we just need to define sin in terms of relationship. Okay, loss of relationship. Is he's going to call it the new face of Pelagianism. If you're not aware of Pelagianism, it's an earlier theologian during the time of Augustine that seemed to state, and the reason I say seemed to state is because John Wesley said when he read his work that he was just trying to defend the free will. But he seemed to state that you can earn your own salvation, that there is no original sin. Okay, so he's the father of that movement, and Augustine won the day, standing against him and saying, no, there is original sin. So listen to it. He says, the new face of Pelagianism is the current emphasis on sin and holiness as strictly relational, and the corresponding discontinuity of sinfulness as a condition of human nature, as fallen, and holiness as a restored state of nature. So, sin and holiness, they have to be juxtaposed in this way. That's why he was able to make his argument in the article that her definition of sin has to correspond with her definition of holiness. Okay, if she makes all moral choice, then her definition of sin has to follow. And you hear him doing the same thing here. Okay, now here's his defense. Behind this school of thought are motifs of both existentialism and process theology, stemming from process philosophy a la Whitehead. Okay, so he's talking about Whitehead. She tells us to go to Whitehead for correction. Okay, in this approach, the locus of reality is not being, but becoming. Therefore, the interest is in change rather than state, in growth more than a specific identifiable condition. It has great difficulty trying to accommodate itself to such Wesleyan concepts as inbred sin, the carnal nature, instantaneous cleansing, and works of grace. And, he even goes a step further than this, to talk about how there has to be a correction. And it's when people try to define original sin is nothing but a loss of relationship, and he tells you that it has to have the condition, and it has to be defined that way. Okay, so let's listen to what he has to say about that. Wynkoop says, and I quote her, "Sin is simply the absence of this relationship because man has repudiated it." So that is her direct statement, where she says that original sin is just a choice we make today. It's not a condition that's already been placed upon mankind, as the Bible says it clearly it is. And so she denies it. Okay, right there you can hear her doing that. But he says part of the problem was Dr. Wynkoop's earnest desire to refute what she considered a false concept of sin. All right, and then he talks about how she thinks it's materialistic. All right, and then, but I want you to hear his full argument, okay, about what he thinks is missing in her definition of original sin. And he's not the only one. Dr. Donald Metz believed the same way, and wrote a book called Some Crucial Issues in the Church of Nazarene in 1994. And he again defended this very same argument, that all she's saying is original sin is a loss of relationship. It's not a identifiable condition, a positive desire to do wrong, not just a negative, but a positive desire to do wrong. Hear him defend himself. Taylor says relational theology becomes aberrant, or off base, when its advocates impress upon it the categories and concepts of process theology. This results in a failure to see that the effecting of right relationships and their maintenance can only be accomplished by real subjective changes in the nature of the relator. Did Jesus teach something very simple there? Yeah, he said you need to clean the inside of the dish first. All right, then the outside will follow. So it's not just relational. Sin is not just outside of us, and it's just a choice we make daily. Okay, sin is a condition that we're subject to until we have this substantive cleansing that needs to take place, or eradication, a better term, of the sin nature, so that we can have the full image of God stamped deep on our hearts. Okay, so for the human relator is sinful by nature and by choice, not just by choice, but by nature. Okay, that's what the Bible says. Read Ephesians chapter 2. Okay, and is hence incapable of right relationships with either God, man, or himself. You can't have be in relationship to mankind, as relational theology suggests, if you don't have a right condition of your heart. The Bible says that you have to love Lord your God first, and then love your neighbor as yourself. You can't do the second commandment before you do the first. That's why Jesus prioritizes it. Okay. So he's sinful by nature and by choice, and is hence incapable of right relationships with either God, man, or himself. It is his or her sinfulness which is the moral impediment to harmonious relationships. If the relationist replies, so here's their argument back, that disharmonious relationships do not result from sinfulness but constitute the sinfulness, it becomes necessary to remind them that deeply rooted in Orthodox Wesleyanism is the doctrine of original sin, the need for a real change called regeneration, and that these changes, and a deeper real change called entire sanctification, okay, and that these changes become not only the means by which right relationships are affected, but the condition of these are for those relationships. You can't relate rightly or wrongly to anybody else, okay, unless the sin condition is dealt with. Okay, the Bible is very clearly telling us that our relationships are lost. We are not in a relationship with our fellow mankind when we're in sinfulness. Okay, the Bible says that we are separate from God. We are separate from each other. How do we know that? Well, when they were claiming that Abraham was their father, according to process philosophy, that'd be an accurate statement. Process theology would say that all mankind is in relationship with each other automatically. So, sinful Pharisees had every right in that theory to say that they were related, wrongly or rightly, they were related to Abraham. But that's not what Jesus said. Jesus said, Abraham's not your father. He said, if you were Abraham's descendants, you'd do what he did. Okay? And obviously, he's saying that they have to have their hearts substantively changed. You know, they need to have the inside of the dish cleaned. They have this inherited nature, and it needs to be clean in order for them to have a heart that wants to do right, like Ezekiel 36:25-27 says. So you can hear he's making a perfect argument, okay, against her philosophy / theology. And you can hear what her statement was. Again, I repeat to you her statement before, where she says in one sentence exactly what I said she was saying. She said, sin is simply the absence of this relationship because man has repudiated it. Okay? You know, that sounds like an ethical choice. It sounds like sin is moral. It sounds like I have the choice to make. Not Adam and Eve sin, and sin was passed on to me, but I have the choice to make, and, you know, whether I have inherited sin or not. Okay? Very clearly she's been making this argument if you go through her works. And so I want you to see that, you know, I think Taylor has defended himself. I think Donald Metz, I think Robert Childs, I think they make the perfect argument. And, you know, you can see these theologians standing against Wynkoop. Again, I think she's known for her infamy. I don't think she's known for her positive influence. I think she's known for her infamy. And if not, I want to ask you why. I want to ask you why, if there's so much confrontation that these professional theologians would go to the extent they did to warn us about them and their influence, why is there nobody who is explaining this to others? Okay, I think it needs to be discussed. I think it needs to be put in open forum, and people need to have an opportunity to share what their heart's worry or concern is. And, you know, these things need to be brought to the matter of the higher stages in the church after the fact, so that people can hear what the church really believes about the matter. All right, thank you.